Thank you all. It's good to be here again. I can't remember when I first started coming to Forum and talking to you all. It was at least 20-something years ago, because I know when my son was really young, he used to come with me because he loved the free breakfast. I'm sure he loved all of you too, but he loved the free breakfast. Now he is, out of graduate school and moved out of the house and is 26 years old, and, time flies. Anyway, he is not with us this morning because I don't think he's even awake yet. Okay, so thank you all for being here, and I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in local politics right now, and some of the things that are happening. And I want to start off, because it's on everybody's mind, with the amazing disappearing District 4 supervisor. I think you all are familiar with the situation, but it actually tells us a lot, about this mayor and about where things are going. So, background, you all know a gentleman named Joe Longardio was elected supervisor from District 4 after the district was gerrymandered to make it more conservative. He beat Gordon Marr, who had been the incumbent, very progressive candidate. And then, after getting elected, Joe Longardio did two things. One is he led the battle to close the Great Highway. Right. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. The other thing he did is he strongly endorsed the idea of more density, tall buildings, what we call upzoning on the west side. Right. Zoning is a set of rules that determine what you can build where. And in San Francisco, which is a dense, fully built out city, land use and zoning are critical issues. Right? Why? Because in most parts of San Francisco, if you want to build something new, you have to knock down something that's already there, because there's not a whole lot of empty space. Okay? So what are you allowed to knock down, and what are you allowed to replace it with, and how big can it be? These are really important issues in the city, which, again, I will come back to. Right? The Great Highway was an interesting battle that went on the ballot, and pretty much everyone on the east side of town voted for it. And pretty much everyone on or 65% of the people in District 4 voted against it. And they voted against it because some people didn't like the idea of closing a highway for a park. Right? But also, people who live in that area realized that that was the north-south artery that they used to get around. And the problem with closing it, not that I'm against getting rid of roads and putting in parks. I barely ever drive myself. I ride my bike everywhere. I'm all in favor of this idea. But there isn't a whole lot of transit on the west side to replace this. Right? It's not like we suddenly put in 5 or 6 Muni lines on dedicated streets to get you from Daly City to Land's End. All right, and along that stretch. There just isn't. So what's happened? People are still driving because there's no Muni, and they're taking Sunset, and they're taking the crosstown track through Golden Gate Park, and the traffic in those places is horrible. Also, the other thing that people do is they just go along like 47th, 48th Avenues, and they drive way too fast through those neighborhoods where people live, right? So a lot of people were unhappy with this. So they put together a petition to recall Joe Longardio. Now, I'm not in favor of recalls as a general rule. Recalls are in the state constitution because of the progressive era when Hiram Johnson was governor in the 1920s and Southern Pacific controlled the state legislature and most cities. And the progressive reform was, the initiative, if the state legislature won't do something, the voters can. The referendum, if the state legislature does something awful, the voters can repeal it. And the recall, which basically means if everybody in the state legislature is corrupt, or if someone in the state is corrupt and gets elected in a corrupt fashion, the voters have the right to say, no, we don't want that person anymore. Right? It's been abused. It was abused badly in San Francisco when they decided to recall the district attorney, Chesa Boudin, and then several members of the school board who, whatever you believe about Chesa Boudin's policies, he wasn't corrupt, and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Right? He was a competent district attorney who ran on a reform platform and did exactly what he said he was going to do. Right? At any rate, Joe Longardio was a leader in those recall campaigns and then used that to run for supervisor. So he really wasn't in a position to say we shouldn't recall people because we disagree with them, because that's exactly what he had just done. Okay, so the recall was successful, overwhelmingly successful. 65, 66% of the people voted to recall Joe Longardio. Right? Part of this was the Great Highway. Right? That was what everybody talked about. The Great Highway, but there was a lot more to it. And I know, because I know a lot of the people who were door knocking in that area. And what they were finding was, yeah, people were mad about the Great Highway. They were also really mad about the upzoning plan. they were really mad about more density. And there's reasons for that, both good and bad. Some of it is people just like their single-family neighborhood and don't want more density. Right? The other element of this, though, and we will come back to this in a second, is that more density in that area, first of all, it is not well served by transit, right? And second, to put denser buildings on the west side of town, you have to destroy something that's there now. You have to demolish existing housing or existing commercial buildings. And a lot of people are really nervous about that. I'm going to come back to that in a second when we talk about the upzoning and density. Right? But the upshot of this is that there's a vacancy now in District 4 supervisor. And the mayor's got kind of a problem because he got a lot of support when he ran on the west side. When he ran, and this is a very interesting phenomenon that we're seeing nationwide, the debate, particularly in more conservative parts of cities, a couple of years ago was all about crime. We were coming out of the pandemic, crime, car break-ins, crime, Jessa Boudin, crime, all right? And Daniel Lurie ran and said, I'm going to be the toughest guy. London Breed was the mayor. She was pretty tough on crime, but he said, I'm going to be even tougher, right? Well, things have shifted. People have, number one, woken up and realized, wait a minute, San Francisco is not filthy and crime-ridden. Certainly the west side of town is not filthy and crime-ridden. Right? And second, the real issue is not crime, it's affordability. And Zoran Mandami ran on this and got elected mayor of New York. And I think people are starting to recognize that, right? So Daniel Lurie, though, got a lot of support on the west side of town, talking about crime. And now people are kind of shifting their concerns. And they don't like what he calls his family zoning plan. I refer to it as the rich family zoning plan, which I'll come back to in a minute, right? This is not popular on the west side. So now he's got to appoint a supervisor who will vote for that plan because he needs 6 votes. And so he's got to find someone who will vote for that plan. But then that person is going to have to face the voters in June against other candidates. And if they vote for that plan, they may very well lose their job. So what does Lurie do? Well, he looks around and he looks around and he looks around, and he's having a hard time finding someone who can both vote for the things he wants and survive an election. So out of nowhere, he appoints a woman named Alcarez, who is a former pet store owner, has no political background, never even involved in community organizing, never stuffed envelopes, never walked a precinct, no political involvement at all. And the word I hear out of his office is they were looking for somebody with no negatives. They're looking for, she's a nice young woman who teaches kids music on her own time and used to run a pet store and is Filipino. We've never had a Filipino supervisor from that district. He does a poll with a fake name. What would you think about a small business owner who teaches music to kids and, and everybody says, oh, that sounds great. So he appoints this woman who no one had ever heard of before. I mean, her friends probably had. But Lurie told us when he was running for mayor, as we've heard from other people who run for mayor from the private sector, that the private sector is more competent and efficient. And in government, these people in government, they just waste money. They're not very competent. You get all these people who are elected, and they're not really, it's not like the private sector. Well, he'd actually been in the nonprofit sector, but nevertheless, this was the kind of line. We need someone from the outside who can really shake things up and knows how to run a city. Well, he clearly doesn't know how to run a city in the political sense, because, first of all, being a mayor of San Francisco is a political job. For better or for worse, being a supervisor is a political job. And as my old boss at the Bay Guardian, Bruce Brugman, used to say, before you play in the big leagues, you need a little minor league or sandlot experience in politics. It doesn't mean you have to have held elective office. Right? AOC got elected to Congress without holding a lower office, but she had been very active in politics. She worked on Bernie Sanders' campaign. She was a community organizer. She worked on environmental issues. She had some political experience. She had a lot of political experience, actually. This young woman did not. And he never checked, he never vetted her. I teach investigative reporting at USF, and I tell my students, if you're trying to get background on someone who's running for office, right, you look for, number one, you look for victims and enemies, right? You look for someone they've been in a fight with, maybe justifiably, maybe not. But the second thing is you always talk to anyone they were in business with. If somebody is a business person and they run for office, you talk to their employees. What kind of a boss was she? Was she a horrible boss who yelled at you all the time? Did she stiff you on your wages? Was she a great boss who paid decent benefits and made sure that your health care was taken care of? What kind of, and if someone just did a deal with someone else, what kind of a deal was it? Did she come through with all of the things she promised? Did she stiff you, right? What kind of a deal was it? Well, they never bothered to ask the person who bought her pet store, who, after this person was appointed, several reporters smartly called the person who bought the pet store, who said, when I walked in, the place was filthy. There were piles of mice feces, rat feces, dead animals, and the place was a mess. And she hadn't been paying her back rent, and there were all these other problems. Okay, so fair enough. The mayor says, yeah, it's tough running a small business. It's tough running a pet stop. I know she had some problems, but that's okay. Next, the woman shares some text messages that she had with Alcaraz that say, you don't have to worry about cash, you don't have to worry about taxes because we pay our employees under the table, right? And a bunch of other things like that, right? Every time you go out to dinner, charge it as a business expense, and then you won't have to pay taxes, right? All of the stuff that is unseemly, but also illegal, right? So, and there was a lot more that was going to come out about her, apparently. So the mayor, after 7 days, asked her to resign, and she did. And now he's got to find someone else. What this says to me is that when it comes to politics, the mayor of San Francisco is not terribly competent. This was easy. This is not hard. This is, you know, I tell my students, this is journalism 101, right? This is real simple. It doesn't take much. And he claimed he hired an outside investigative firm to look into her. If they did, they didn't do a terribly good job either. So it makes Lurie look incompetent, but it also puts a focus back again on D4. What are we going to do? What is he going to do? Who's he going to appoint? Who's he going to find now that's willing to step up and do this? Who's willing to vote against what the residents of the district want? By the way, Supervisor Connie Chan, I'll talk about her in a minute, is talking about putting a measure on the ballot to reopen the Great Highway. Whether this is a good idea or not, I'm not here to debate. There's lots of arguments on either side of that. But the supervisor who the mayor appoints is going to have to take a stand on that, and is going to have to take a stand very soon on the new zoning plan. And I'm going to talk about it in a minute. And that's going to put that person in a very tough situation. Who can he find who will vote his way and still has a chance of getting reelected? He had a hard time. I mean, he had a hard time. It wasn't that he was delaying. It wasn't that he was just sitting around, you know, having beer and pizza and not thinking about who to appoint. He actually was having a hard time finding a candidate. And I think he's going to have an even harder time finding a candidate now, right? So that seat remains open. And as I say, it shows to me that there's a problem with putting someone from the outside with no political experience in a political job because they just don't get it, right? Okay, I want to move on to another important thing that's happening this year. We'll get a new District 4 supervisor, and then that person will face the voters in June. The voters in June are also going to be weighing in on a new member of Congress. Right? Nancy Pelosi, after 20 terms, 40 years in Congress, decided that she doesn't want to run for re-election again. Right? That was her decision. Unlike some other members of Congress who are 85 years old, she actually was completely with it, and she doesn't seem to be suffering from dementia or any physical, but she decided, I think wisely, that it was time to retire and move on. Right? That the Democratic Party is obviously looking for new and, you know, not to be ageist, but new and younger or fresher faces, and I think she realized it was time to move on. Right? That leaves an opening in one of the safest congressional seats in the country. And the person who wins, I am 67 years old, the person who wins will no doubt be my congressperson until I'm dead, because that person will be there for 30, 40, 50 more. Maybe I'll live to be 110, probably not, right? So this is a really important seat, right? It's also always been, because it's a safe seat, it's always been a seat for someone who has risen to national prominence. Some of you will remember Phil Burton, who rose to national prominence, created the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, a lot of other stuff. Right? After Phil died relatively young, his wife Sala took over, and then when she died, it went to Nancy Pelosi. Now let's just remember for a second, and I'm just a little bit of history here. When Nancy Pelosi ran for Congress, she was an outsider. She had never held elective office before, but she was very much involved in politics. She was a Democratic Party leader and a fundraiser. Right? She had no local roots. She'd never held local office. She'd never done much locally, but she was definitely not politically inexperienced. She was a Democratic Party insider. Okay, she ran against a guy named Harry Britt, who some of you may remember. Harry Britt was a contemporary of Harvey Milk. He took Harvey Milk's seat when Harvey Milk was assassinated. He had left a video saying, if I am killed, I want the mayor to appoint one of two people, Ann Cronenberg or Harry Britt, to my seat, because when that video became public, Dianne Feinstein, then the mayor, had no choice, and she chose Harry Britt. Harry was a Democratic Socialist, and I thought a really good member of the Board of Supervisors. He is the reason that we have rent control today in San Francisco. He is the reason that we have civilian oversight of the police. He is the reason that we have a lot of other very positive things, right? Harry ran for Congress. He would have been the first, I think he would have been at the time the only out gay man in Congress. He certainly would have been the first gay man elected running as a gay man for Congress. The Chronicle consistently referred to him as that homosexual socialist. Seriously, they kept referring to Harry Britt as the homosexual socialist. And although he won on election day, Nancy Pelosi did a really good get out the vote, absentee vote campaign. She had tons of money, and she had the support of the old Burton machine. And the old Burton machine folks did not want to see a independent-minded Democratic socialist who wouldn't listen to what the machine said. They wanted a loyal Democrat. And that's what they got in Nancy Pelosi, who, again, had a distinguished record in Congress. But her constituency wasn't really San Francisco. It was the National Democratic Party. I remember when she became Speaker of the House, somebody from, I think it was Roll Call magazine on the Hill, called me and said, hey, you're a political reporter in San Francisco. Now we have the San Francisco leftist with San Francisco values as Speaker of the House. What do you think about that? And I said, you know, everybody just needs to chill. Right? Nancy Pelosi is not a San Francisco leftist. I am a San Francisco leftist. Nancy Pelosi is a very mainstream centrist Democrat who will represent the interests of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And that's, I'm not saying for better or for worse, that's what her job is as Speaker. But for God's sakes, don't have everybody walk around saying, oh my God, San Francisco values a San Francisco liberal. Nancy Pelosi is a mainstream centrist Democrat. This, of course, got the attention of every right-wing news media outlet in New York. And Hannity's calling and Laura Ingram's calling. And they're all, you think Nancy Pelosi's too conservative? And I said, no, I think Nancy Pelosi is a mainstream Democrat. Right? And that's what she did. She became Speaker of the House. She helped pass Obamacare. She, kept the Democrats in power for a long time, and we can give her tremendous credit for that. Right? Now we have a chance, possibly, to elect someone who is closer to a San Francisco progressive to that seat in Congress. Right? We have two people who have announced they're running, and one is Scott Wiener. Scott Wiener has been a very effective legislator in Sacramento. He has also been very much aligned with the real estate industry and with the landlords and the real estate industry, right? We'll talk more about that in a second. Shoykat Chakrabarty is also running. He is running, and I think he was here last week. He's running to try to run to the left. He was AOC's chief of staff for a while. The problem with Shoykat is he doesn't understand anything about local politics. And, all politics is local. This is going to be a local race as well as a national race. Right? And Shoykat, who is worth more than $100 million, he was one of the early employees at Stripe, so he's a tech multimillionaire. As most of you know, in San Francisco politics, there really are two sides. And they are sometimes almost as different as Republicans and Democrats used to be. Republicans and Democrats now, it's like, oh, but there is a faction in San Francisco politics that is supported by and loyal to the billionaire class. And there is a group in San Francisco politics that is opposed to the billionaire class, in favor of higher taxes on the rich, and loyal to a larger progressive agenda. Right? Bilal Mahmoud is part of the billionaire slate, ran against the one elected Democratic Socialist, Dean Preston, and he won in part with Shoykat's money. Right? Shoykat supported the billionaire slate for the Democratic County Central Committee, which helped shift power on the Board of Supervisors to the billionaires. Right? Most people, now, again, he defends that. He says, well, I really liked Bilal. He was a tech guy. I liked him. I liked Michael Lai, who was another billionaire slate guy. But that's not how it works in San Francisco. Right? For better or for worse, you're on our side or you're not on our side. Right? And so I don't think he's going to get a lot of traction with the left. And I don't think he's going to get a lot of traction on the west side of town in the more conservative votes. I don't see a path for him. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. I don't see a path for him to get elected. Scott Wiener has won he's won a couple of citywide races for the state Senate. He got elected to the Board of Supervisors. He has a long track record. People know who he is. Right? And obviously, he kind of appears at this point to be the front runner. Scott has also thought for like 20 years that the seat was his, that as soon as Pelosi left, he would just kind of waltz into that seat. But that's not what's going to happen, I think. Right? There's a chance, and I'm going to be very careful here because I have not spoken to Connie Chan about this, but there were a lot of people who are saying that Connie Chan, who's the supervisor from District 1, might consider getting into the race. Right? And I'm saying, I don't know whether she is. I think that would be great. I remember, God, I was here, what was it, a year and a half ago or so, and I was talking about the mayor's race, and I said, you know, a lot of people think Aaron Peskin might get into the race, and I think that would be great. I get home and my phone is ringing, and it's Aaron. Did you just tell the Unitarian Universalists that I'm running for mayor? Word travels fast. And I said, no. I said, I think you should. So I'm not saying that Connie Chan is going to run for Congress, but I think if she did, she'd have a path. And here's why. Let me go back to the upzoning for a minute, right? Because this is a absolutely critical issue in San Francisco that's going to come to a head sometime in the next few weeks, right? There has been talk for a long time about San Francisco having a housing shortage, and California having a housing shortage, right? And a shortage of millions of units of housing. Right? That's actually not exactly accurate. The population of San Francisco has not increased dramatically, and in fact, housing has been built in San Francisco at about the rate of the population increase, and this is actually the case in California too. What we have is we have an affordable housing shortage. That's what we have. Right? If you're rich, all right, if you're a rich person, you can find a place to live in San Francisco. It's not hard. If you can afford $5,000 a month rent, there's plenty of places to rent. Right? If you can afford to pay $3 million for a house, there's plenty of houses for $3 million. Right? What there is an affordable housing shortage. Right? Now, what do we do about that? The group that identifies as YIMBYs, saying, yes, in my backyard, we need more, is talking about the solution being to build more housing. And I love the term, San Francisco needs to build more housing. Scott Wiener says, San Francisco needs to build more housing at all levels. There's a little bit of a problem with that, which is that San Francisco doesn't build any housing at all. I wish San Francisco built housing. In the 60s, San Francisco built public housing with government money, and the city managed it and didn't do always a very good job, and public housing became a place where only very poor people lived, and the city didn't manage it very well. We actually know how to do that a lot better now. We know how to do, as a society, we know how to do social housing. I wish San Francisco would build housing, but we don't. Developers build housing. And there's two types of developers in San Francisco. There are for-profit developers and there are nonprofit developers. For-profit developers build housing to make money. They do not build housing to house people. They build housing to make money. That is simply how capitalism works. And for-profit developers are only going to build if they can make enough money to provide adequate returns for their investors. Right? Particularly large scale, not, hardly anyone's building like single-family houses anymore. But the bigger housing projects, the kind of housing projects that Scott Wiener's talking about, housing projects with 20, 30, 40, 50 units, big apartment buildings, right? They are not financed by your local Bank of America branch. This is not the days where some small developer would go into the bank and say, hi, Madam Banker, will you loan me money? I'm going to build an apartment building. It's not like that anymore. This is now international speculative investment capital. Right? It's pension funds, it's hedge funds, it's all this that goes. And international capital goes where the highest return is. For many, many years, this is just basic economics, right? For many, many years, the highest return for capital was office buildings in San Francisco, New York, LA, and a few other places, right? I was here during the 80s when everyone says no one was building housing. The left, the progressives, were begging for housing. We were demanding. We pushed something called the Office Housing Production Program that said every time you build an office, you have to build housing for the workers. We were pushing this really hard. Dianne Feinstein, of course, didn't like that because it would cost the office developers money, so it never got very far. But why was no housing being built in the 1980s? Because you made more profit building offices. It's really simple. Developers were building what got the highest return on investment, which was office buildings. Then we move into the 90s, and the highest return on investment is luxury condos in San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, and Vancouver, BC. That's where the highest return was. So that's what got built. luxury condos. And a lot of those luxury condos were never occupied, certainly not by people who were moving from a smaller place to a condo in San Francisco, making room for someone else to move into their place. In fact, I used to go into a lot of those new high-rise condo buildings and knock on doors to see if anyone lived there. What I do, I would try to dress fairly nicely and stand by the door and wait till someone walked in. I'm admitting to something that I probably shouldn't in public, and then I would follow them in, and then I'd walk around and knock on doors and say, I'm a reporter, I'm just curious, what you think about this building and your neighbors and what kind of a community is here. And the few people who answered their doors said, I don't know any of my neighbors, nobody else lives on this hall. I'm the only one who lives here, right? What happened? Those condos became places, investment properties for international money. It became people, for example, people from Russia, China, a few other countries who wanted to get their money out of the country bought a solid investment, which is condos in San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York or Vancouver, BC. I am not in favor of this. For a second, I'm going to tell you about something that I'm not in favor of, right? Vancouver, BC passed a law a few years ago saying you had to be a Canadian citizen to buy housing in Canada, in Vancouver, BC. I think that's a terrible idea. I'm totally against that. It's xenophobic. You shouldn't have to be a citizen of anywhere. But the interesting economic fact is housing prices dropped. Why? Because all of the international speculators weren't able to buy there anymore. All right. I'll talk about Vancouver in a second. At any rate, so that's one of the reasons why housing hasn't been built. So it isn't all red tape. It isn't NIMBYism. It's capitalism. So now the state legislature, in response to the real estate industry and the YIMBY organizing, and by the way, anyone in Sacramento will tell you that the state legislature right now is controlled by the real estate industry, telecom, and tech. So with the support of the real estate industry, the state legislature has passed a bunch of bills basically mandating that cities allow a lot more housing. Right? And the primary architect of this has been Scott Wiener, right, who says, again, we need more housing at all levels. So the Wiener's bills have basically said, San Francisco must build San Francisco doesn't build any housing. San Francisco must provide for the construction of 84,000 units of housing in the next 8 years. Now, first of all, that's physically impossible. We don't have the construction infrastructure to do that. Particularly, Trump is now deporting a lot of immigrants. Guess who builds the buildings, folks? Right? Guess who does construction work in the city? Set that aside for a second. Right? In order to do that, of course, we will have to demolish existing buildings. There are not vacant spaces enough in San Francisco for 84,000 new apartment units. Now, by the way, of those, according to the state rules, 35,000 are supposed to be affordable, below market rate. That's not going to happen. Why? Because that would cost $19 billion. That's what the data shows. Right? That would cost where's that money coming from? Well, Scott Wiener has not given it to San Francisco from the state. The state has put all these mandates on us. You have to allow more housing, but hasn't given us any money to build that affordable housing. The city doesn't have $19 billion. Right? Trump isn't going to give it to us. Where's that going to come from? The answer is every time I ask a planning commissioner, the planning director, politicians, the mayor about this, they all say, oh yeah, that's going to be a challenge. That's the word they use. Building that affordable housing is going to be a challenge. It's impossible without money. It's not going to happen. Right? So now we're going to build more housing. Well, why are we building more housing? Because the prices are too high. Because the theory is, it's basic supply and demand, right? If there's not enough of something, the price goes up. Right? So why don't we just build more of it? And then eventually the price will come down. The problem is no one is going to build housing that is not luxury housing right now because there's not enough return on it. All we're going to get, that's why I call it the rich family zoning plan. All you're going to get is housing for very wealthy people. Right? And which we already have a lot of housing for very wealthy people. Right? So the city economist, who was a smart guy, very conservative guy, I mean, conservative by my standards. He is not by any means a leftist radical economist. He just recently did a study of this. And he talked a lot about the price elasticity of demand for housing and a lot of other factors and regression analysis and all this stuff. But the bottom line is, he came out and he said, basically, if developers were to build all that new housing in San Francisco, prices would come down by 9%. Rent would go from $3,500 a month to $3,349 or something. Does that make it affordable? Reducing rental prices over the next 5 years by 9% is not going to solve the affordability crisis. And that's not me saying that. That's that's the relatively conservative city economist who looked at the numbers and realized, no one's going to build middle-class housing because there's no money for it. There's not enough money in it. Okay, now, given that, and given that really the only solution to the housing crisis is building affordable housing, which is going to require money, right? And I'll come back to that in a second. What's going to happen here? Okay, first of all, in an affordability crisis, in an affordable housing crisis, the most valuable housing is existing affordable housing. And that is existing rent-controlled housing. That's the most valuable housing right now, more valuable than anything you can build anywhere. It's existing rent-controlled housing is the most valuable. Okay, so let's take, for example, let's look at the west side of town. Let's take like the Geary or Clement corridors, right? According to Scott Wiener's new bills, those are, quote, transit corridors. Right? Those are, thank you. Those are places where you have easy access to transit. Right? That's where new density should be built, according to this, what they call the new urbanist theory. Density should be built along transit corridors, because then people don't need cars. Right? Now, set aside for a second the idea that rich people are not going to drive anywhere. Right? This is San Francisco. This is not Manhattan, where everybody takes the subway. Even if you do have transit corridors, how are the wealthy people going to get around? They're going to get, if they don't have a car, they're going to take Uber and they're going to take Waymo. Right? They're going to take these ride services. By the way, how are they going to get their deliveries? Because wealthy people get food delivered, get packages delivered. It's going to come the same way. This is going to cause more congestion, even if it's on a transit corridor. But never mind that for a second. You all are familiar with this area. Think about Geary or Clement. You walk along Geary Street, and like around 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, from Arguello out to 19th. What is it? It's a lot of small businesses. And it's a lot of low-rise. It's a lot of like 2- and 3-story buildings. Right? Typically with a small business on the ground floor and 1 or 2 apartment units above it. Okay? What happens if you demolish those buildings? Because you can't build denser housing along Geary Street without demolishing what's there already. There aren't a lot of empty spaces. So you're going to demolish those 1 or 2-story buildings, and that small business, right, that's all going to be demolished. Okay, so what happens then? Well, the units above that small business are rent controlled. Right. According to the latest version of the mayor's rich family zoning plan, rent-controlled housing of more than 3 units will be exempt from demolition. But a lot of those are 1 and 2 units along Geary. And a lot of that's 1 and 2 unit rent-controlled housing. That's going to be demolished. The tenants are gone, of course. Right? There's no provision to provide them with rent-controlled housing at the same price, or to allow them to move back in at the same price when a new building is built. Right? And that small business is gone forever. They will not be able to come back because the rent will be too high. Right? I will tell you how this works. One of my favorite restaurants in the Mission was a place called the Sunrise Cafe. It was a Salvadoran Mexican place, and I used to go there all the time because they had great huevos rancheros, and it was inexpensive. And it was basically just a woman and her husband and her daughter ran this place. That was on 24th Street around Folsom. And I was in there a few years ago, and the woman said, I don't know how much longer we can last. The landlord just raised my rent from $3,500 a month to $8,000 a month. And I said, wow. I mean, there's no commercial rent control. The state won't let us have commercial rent control. So there's nothing she could do. And she said to me, and I told him, it's just my husband, me, and my daughter. We're working as hard as we can. We work 7 days a week. We can't, there's no more money we can make. There's no way to do it. And the landlord said to her, well, just raise your prices. And she said, if I raise my prices, my clients won't be able to afford to eat here. And he said, it doesn't matter, the neighborhood's changing, richer people are moving in. So just raise your prices and the wealthier people will come. Right? That's how it works. She went out of business. But that's what will happen with these small businesses. The new rent for that commercial space will not be what they're paying now. It'll be much higher. So we're going to see the destruction of hundreds of small businesses along, for example, the Geary Clement corridors, places like that. Right? So a lot of people who live in these areas, who live on the west side of town, are starting to say, wait a minute, that's not a good idea. Right? We shouldn't be sending in bulldozers and demolishing small businesses and rent-controlled housing to put up housing for taller, denser, housing for richer people, which won't be affordable anyway. Right? Now, some people, again, don't want any density at all. right? Some people say, sure, let's have more density, but let's make sure we have the transit capacity for it. I actually asked the mayor about this about a month ago. I ran into him at City Hall, and I said, Mr. Mayor, suppose this all works out and we build, say, 40, 50,000 more units on the west side of town. Who's going to pay for the muni capacity to get all those people around? And he said, well, you know, once we get our house in order, we'll worry about that later. We'll figure that out later. That's always what seems to happen with muni. We'll figure that out later. With the rent-controlled, with the affordable housing, oh, that's going to be a challenge. We'll figure that out later. Okay, so here's how this plays into the congressional race. Right? Scott Wiener is the reason we're having to do this. Well, Lurie's going around. He was in District 4 a couple weeks ago. He's going to be in District 1 on Thursday. If anybody's in District 1, he's doing an event at the Internet Archive. Former Supervisor Sandy Fewer's going to moderate it. It's a town hall, right? Thursday at 6:30, I think. And what he says to people is, look, you may not like my upzoning plan, but if we don't get this through and the state doesn't approve it, it's going to be worse, because under the Scott Wiener legislation and a few others in Sacramento, if the Department of Housing and Community Development, Gavin Newsom's Department of Housing and Community Development, does not approve a city's plan to build enough new housing, then something called the builder's remedy kicks in. And that means we lose all control of all zoning. And we become Houston, and anyone can build anything they want anywhere, and we have no local control at all. So Lurie's saying, well, you know, if we don't do my thing, it's going to be even worse. Which may be true. But why is that? It's because of Scott Wiener. Right? Scott Wiener and his allies created this situation where we now have to do this. Right? I'm not sure that flies very well in a congressional race. I'm not sure that people on the west side of town, once they realize that this is not just Daniel Lurie, this is something that Scott Wiener and his allies in Sacramento have forced upon us, I'm not sure that he's going to get all that much support on the west side of town for that, particularly if he has a candidate running against him who says, I don't want to see small businesses and tenants displaced. Right? That is what Connie Chan, Supervisor Connie Chan, has been saying. She is trying to amend the legislation to protect rent-controlled housing and small businesses. Right? I don't know, maybe that flies better on the west side of town. Connie Chan would have solid support among the 27, 28% of the voters who are solid progressives. And I think she would get a lot of support on the west side of town as people come around and realize that when the bulldozers move into the bulldozers start moving into the sunset in the Richmond, that is because of the state legislature, and Scott Wiener was one of the leaders in the movement to make that happen. Right? That may, as I say, this is going to play out over the next few months. Connie Chan has not told me that she's running, but a lot of people are suggesting to her that she does. And if she does, that would make it a really interesting race with Scott Wiener and her, who would probably come in first and second, and then they'd run again in November because we have a top 2 primary. So this is going to take up, this congressional race is going to take up a lot of the year, and it's going to be really, really important because it's going to set the tone for San Francisco politics for some time to come. I have heard a lot of people, after Mondami got elected, I got all these calls from people who said, this isn't fair. How come New York has Zoran Mondami and AOC, and we have Daniel Lurie and Scott Wiener? This isn't fair. But maybe, you know, if Scott Wiener does not get elected and the kind of billionaire side of things takes a hit in a more progressive person, that will set the tone for what's going on in San Francisco politics for a while. So it's going to be a really interesting time. Right now, I just want to talk for a second. I'm going to run out of time in a minute. I'm going to talk for a second about a couple other things that fit into this. All right. So Zoran Mondami ran for mayor of New York saying, we can have nice things. We can have free childcare. We can have fast, affordable transportation. We can have affordable housing. How are we going to do that? We're going to tax the rich. We're going to tax the very rich. We're going to raise the city income tax on the very wealthy to pay for this, all right? Which New York has a city income tax. Now, he's got to get permission from the governor, and there's a lot of complications to it, but New York has a city income tax. And they can tax very rich people. And of course, we hear all, oh my God, the rich people will all move New York, will all flee Manhattan because of the taxes. No, they're not. Manhattan's really expensive. The rich people aren't going to flee Manhattan because they have to pay a little tiny bit more taxes, which, by the way, is deductible from their federal taxes anyway, because state and local taxes are federal deductible, so it's actually money from Washington. We don't have that in San Francisco. We do not have a city income tax. Why? Because the state legislature won't let us. Why? Because the likes of Scott Wiener and many others in the state legislature, I'm not just blaming him, have refused to even consider giving cities permission to have a local income tax. I asked Scott about it at an event recently, and I said, you know, why can't we? He said, oh, it'll never get out of committee. We'll never get a vote for it, da, 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 da. But let's take a look at the reality. Right? The Internal Revenue Service, whatever else you think of them, has some great data nerds. Right? They have people who you can call up, and I've done this in the past. You call the IRS press office and you ask to speak to one of their data people. And then there's a lot of people like me there who are data nerds, right? And I talked to one of them a while back and we looked at numbers. And I was able to use their data to conclude that if we were to tax just the 4,000 richest people in San Francisco, just at the rate that they're saving from the Trump tax cuts, we would have no budget deficit. In fact, that would bring in about $600, $700 million a year. Just from 4,000 people. And just taxing their income at the level that they saved from the Trump tax cuts, which of course we're all against, right? We're all against the Trump tax cuts. Everyone in San Francisco thinks the Trump tax, but if we were to recover that money with a local income tax, we would have no budget deficit. We would have plenty of money for affordable housing. We could have nice things. We could have healthcare. We could have childcare. All we would have to do is tax in San Francisco, the 4,000 or 5,000 richest people. Now imagine if we taxed the 10,000 richest people. And we're talking now about people, we could do a city income tax where you would exempt the first $100,000 of income. All right? No one who makes less than $100,000 pays a penny. You could exempt the first $200,000 worth of income, right? You could do all, you could tax only people with incomes of more than $1 million a year. And we would have that money. And we could do that. There is no reason why we can't do that, except that the legislators who want to demand that we accept more market rate housing won't let us capture that money to build affordable housing. And that's what's happening. By the way, we've heard in the past that if Nancy Pelosi stepped down, her daughter Christine would run for that seat. Her daughter is not running for that seat. She's running for Scott Wiener's seat. She's running for the state legislature. And I'm looking forward to asking her about this. What are you going to do to let us have a local income tax? Just like New York and Philadelphia and Chicago and a lot of other big cities that have a local income tax. In the pantheon of taxes, income taxes are the most fair. Better than property taxes, which are better than sales taxes. Right? Now, what are they talking about? Oh, we got to save muni. Well, we're going to save muni by doing a parcel tax, which is a form of property taxes, and by doing a regional sales tax. Right? Parcel taxes are better than sales taxes because they only impact people who own property. And people who own property generally are better off than people who don't. Not always, but generally speaking. Right? Taxes in San Francisco, taxes are blunt instruments because we can't have the most fair type of tax, which is a local income tax. Right? So if you're going to impose all this stuff on us, why don't you let us have the authority locally to address and mitigate the problems? Right? Am I supposed to stop now and take questions? 5 months. Okay, good, because I got time for one more topic. Okay, the mayor is now putting forward a plan for what we call city charter reform. Right? The city charter is San Francisco's constitution. It is a large document. It's 500 plus pages. And everyone talks about how it's way too complicated, it's way too this, it's way too that. And that is true in many ways. And there are many ways in which this thing can be streamlined. Right? But there's also things that are in the city charter because the voters put them there because the politicians would not. For example, the Office of Citizen Complaints, now known as the Department of Police Accountability. Harry Britt put that in the city charter by a vote of the people in 1983. Dianne Feinstein was mayor. She loved the cops. There is no way that piece of legislation that created one of the nation's first local police accountability agencies would ever have passed through the Board of Supervisors and the mayor. There's no way Dianne would have vetoed that the minute she saw it. The same way she vetoed rent control bills, right? Sometimes you have to go to the ballot. So the city charter includes a provision for a Department of Police accountability and includes funding mandates for it. Otherwise, it never would have happened. If there wasn't a funding mandate for that in the city charter, then the mayor right now would simply defund the Department of Police accountability because the cops don't like it, because it holds them accountable, because it's non-cops holding them accountable. Right? There are a number of things like that that are in the city charter that are there for good reason. Now, what the mayor's planning to do is basically, number one, eliminate a lot of things that are in the city charter. And some of them, I agree, there are commissions that don't meet, there's a lack of accountability, there's all kinds of problems with the city charter, and some of these things should be and can be fixed. But the idea of streamlining the city charter by getting rid of things that are in the charter that he says should be in the administrative code. The administrative code, of course, the Board of Supervisors can change anytime they want to. right? That's fine, except that there are some things that the voters basically said, we don't want a Mayor Feinstein, a Mayor Newsom, a Mayor Breed, a Mayor Lurie to defund. Right? We want these things to be constitutionally protected. Right? Now, the other thing that the mayor is talking about, and Spur, the downtown group, advocacy group, is talking about, and I talked to the head of Spur, Sean Ellsburn, who used to be a supervisor and was then Breed's chief of staff. I talked to him about this a few days ago. They want to make it more difficult to put something on the ballot, to put a charter amendment on the ballot. The threshold of voters that is required to sign something to put it is relatively low in San Francisco. It is. It's relatively easy for either 4 supervisors, the mayor, or 10 or 12,000 voters to put something on the ballot before the voters. Right? They want to make that more difficult. They want to eliminate the ability of the mayor or 4 supervisors to put something on the ballot with their signatures, and they want to raise the threshold of how many signatures you have to get to put something on the ballot. Now, I agree, the initiative process has been hijacked, particularly at the state level, by moneyed interests, because it's really hard to gather 1 million signatures to put something on the ballot statewide. Not so in San Francisco. Proposition M, the landmark growth control initiative that basically saved San Francisco from bankruptcy in the late 1980s, when other cities were getting way overbuilt. Houston almost went bankrupt because they'd allowed developers to build so many office towers that no one ever moved into, right? Because the office development was being driven by an excess of investment capital, a surplus of investment capital, not a need for office space. Prop M limited office development in San Francisco and actually helped the city's economy diversify during that period. And when the crash, the office bubble crashed in the late 1980s, and the federal government had to bail out the S&Ls to the tunes of like $500 billion, San Francisco wasn't in such bad shape because we had limited the amount of office growth and required a more diversified economy. Why? Through a ballot initiative. Through a ballot initiative, because the mayor, Dianne Feinstein, would never have allowed that to happen. Right? So when you start messing with direct democracy and the ability of people to put things on the ballot, I'm not saying the charter doesn't need reform. Former Supervisor Tom Ammiano has been talking about charter reform for a long time, but I do think we need to be really careful, and we need to tread carefully when we do that. And we shouldn't just willy-nilly take things out of the city charter and put them in a place that the supervisors can defund or repeal them, because you never know who's going to be the mayor and who's going to be on the board. And at any rate, so that's going to be happening, right? That's going to be happening too. That's going to be happening over the next year, and there will probably be a ballot measure in the fall of 26 to rewrite San Francisco City Charter, and this can be of immense importance. This can change a lot of things. Right? Now, because I like to talk about this, because I think it's absolutely essential for anyone right now to understand, I also asked the Spur guy, Sean Ellsburn, while we're redoing the city charter, why don't we talk about economic inequality? Why don't we look at the city's tax code? The city's tax code is also a mess because we've had to add on different little things here and there, some of them good. We added on a measure to tax property that is sold for more than $10 million to build affordable housing. Now, under the city charter, the mayor is able to not spend that money, and Mayor Breed did that. She took the money that we raised from big corporations, from like the biggest corporations in town, and from high-end property sales that was supposed to go for affordable housing, and she spent it on other things. Because under the city charter, that we have a very powerful mayor. He wants to make the mayor more powerful. We have a very powerful mayor, and the mayor has the ability to just say, well, the voters voted for this, but I'm not going to spend it. Right? We could change that in the city charter. Right? But we have to talk about it. I mean, really, the two existential crises facing our society, and I'll end with this, are climate change and economic inequality. And they are inextricably linked. Right? I am a big fan of Thomas Piketty. I don't know if any of you have read Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty basically says that the money that you make by already being rich greatly exceeds the amount of money that anyone can make through growth in GDP and through working. And that is getting worse and worse and worse. And it's reaching the point where it's destabilizing society, which it is. Which it is. People who are desperate vote for authoritarians, right? We have to address economic inequality, and we have to address it on the national, international, state, but also the local level. Because there are 40 billionaires in San Francisco, right? When I was growing up, there were only 3 billionaires in the entire country. But guess what? We taxed rich people at 80% of their marginal income when I was growing up in the 60s. right? And there were only three billionaires. There was John Paul Getty, Howard Hughes, and the Rockefeller family. That was it. Now there's 40 in San Francisco alone. When I bring this up to people, some people say, well, $1 billion isn't what it used to be. Yeah, it kind of is. Okay, I will stop there and take questions.
We have a lot of questions, and I'm trying to go through. Okay, there's a couple of questions starting out here with Connie Chan.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one, could Connie Chan become our Mondami champion by running against Scott Wiener for the House? You kind of spoke to that.
I mean, yeah, I don't, again, nobody call Connie Chan and say, Tim said she was running for Congress, please. I don't know whether she's running for Congress, but I think if she did, she has a path to victory. And she has a path to victory because I think Scott Wiener is going to lose his popularity on the west side of town. And she is a, Chinese woman who's fluent in Chinese, who is an immigrant, who lives on the west side of town. And I think she could get a lot of support in the Chinese community, the Asian community, and on the west side. And she'll get the solid left. She'll get the 27% of the solid progressives in San Francisco. And together, is there 50% plus one? There could be. There certainly could be.
Okay, here's another Connie Chan question. You've opened up a can of worms here.
Right.
Okay, will Connie Chan be a fierce fighter against MAGA?
I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. I think she will be a fierce fighter against MAGA. In fact, I think anyone we elect will be a fighter against MAGA. That's actually relatively easy for a San Francisco member of Congress to do. Right? Will they be a fierce supporter of raising taxes on the rich? I'm not sure which candidate would do that. I think Connie's more likely to do that than anyone else. But I think that's what we need from San Francisco right now, is not just a fierce fighter of MAGA, but we need someone who will go to Washington and talk seriously about economic inequality. And, Scott Wiener is supposedly this effective legislator, which he is, but Scott could have said to his colleagues, okay, the real estate industry wants more density, and they want the ability, they want to cut all the red tape. Fine, we'll do that in exchange for rent controls on vacant apartments, or commercial rent control, or a local income tax, right? That's what we need in Congress, is somebody who's going to seriously talk about economic inequality.
Okay, here's okay. Here's one about, okay, very simple. Why is Lurie so popular?
I don't know how popular he is today. He was popular because I think people were kind of tired of London Breed. They were tired of the way the city was going. They felt like the city wasn't going in the right direction, and they wanted a change. And here comes Lurie, comes along and says, I'm not from City Hall, I'm an outsider. I'm from an old San Francisco family. I have a lot of connections in the philanthropic world. I'll bring people together. And he also said, I will make it my #1 priority to stop crime and drug dealing. He literally, on the campaign trail, he said, I will stand on the steps of City Hall every day and say, if you're selling fentanyl, don't come to San Francisco. I haven't seen him do that. Yes, so I'm not sure what his popularity is at now. Right? He got elected. And, when a new mayor gets elected, typically they have what's called a honeymoon. Same with a new president. People voted for him. They're giving him a chance. I think the fiasco in D4 has undercut some of his popularity, certainly on the west side of town. And I think the rich family zoning plan, he may be right. If we don't do it, the state may do worse to us. But I think that's going to decrease his popularity a lot on the west side of town. And also, I think in American cities, and we saw this with Zoran, in American cities, the debate has shifted from crime to affordability. And I don't think Lurie plays that well on that one.
Okay, not surprisingly, there's a number of questions about housing. Well, here's one specifically about Geary Boulevard. Geary Boulevard on the west side has a lot of empty lots, abandoned buildings, like the Alexandria, for example, former Walgreens at 17th and so on, and many empty storefronts. Would you be against converting this to housing?
I think we should build a lot more housing in San Francisco. And I tell the Yimbys this. I'm in favor of I'd love to see another 50,000 units of social housing, non-market housing built in San Francisco. There's no reason why we can't do that except money. But but there's no reason. The money is out there. We can do this. We could have this. Right? And some of those vacant places are perfect places for that. Absolutely. There are vacant places where we can build housing. I just don't think, and the disagreement I have with the YIMBYs, and I discuss this with people all the time, I don't think the market's going to solve our problems. I don't think the free market's going to solve our problems. I don't think that allowing more private developers to build more luxury housing is going to bring prices down. I just don't. And, I told one of my email pen pals who's active in the YIMBY movement, I told him, gee, I hope I'm wrong. I would love to see housing affordability in San Francisco. I would love to see housing prices drop. I would love to see my kids be able to afford a house in San Francisco. I think that would be fantastic. I don't believe that's ever going to work this way. I don't believe the private market's going to do it. So I agree. We certainly, if there's going to be more housing built on the west side, it should start with empty places. Now, a vacant storefront doesn't mean that building should be demolished. It may be that the landlord is holding that off the market or has raised the rent so high that no small business can afford it because they assume that they're going to be able to sell that building and have it demolished and turned into something bigger. All right, that happens a lot. That's why we have a storefront vacancy tax in San Francisco, because a lot of those storefronts could be a business, and there's a lot of businesses that would like to move in there if they could afford the rent.
Another related question to Geary Boulevard here. Can you please talk about the housing plans for the Safeway lot on Webster Street and new housing in the Mission area?
Yeah, there are apparently a developer's talking about building a whole lot of new housing on that Safeway site. And actually, I think that's a perfect place for a grocery store. That is now a food desert, and they should have another grocery store in there. Mondami talks about having public grocery stores. Maybe we should have a city grocery store there because that Western Addition area is now a food desert, right? And they need a grocery store there. The Bayview just lost Lucky's. Right? And there are serious problems when you have food deserts. It's harder for people to get fresh, healthy, nutritious food. Anyway, if there's not going to be, and they want to put housing there, maybe they'll put housing, there'll be room for a grocery store on the first floor, I don't know. But I don't think that putting 1,800 units of luxury housing in the middle of the Western Addition is going to make anybody's life better. I really don't. Now, there are places in San Francisco where you can build luxury housing and no one will get displaced. Right? You can build luxury housing in Pacific Heights and no one will get displaced. Right? But in areas where there's already vulnerable communities, existing vulnerable communities, and because we do not have the tools from the state to protect existing vulnerable communities, you get displacement. And it's pretty simple why. I mean, when we were talking about the monster in the Mission, when they wanted to build 350 units of luxury housing at 16th and Mission, what's going to happen if you do that? Well, 700 rich people, it's about 2.1 people per unit, I think is the average in San Francisco. So 700 wealthy people would move into 16th and Mission. Right? All of those small cafes and restaurants and places like my old favorite restaurant will go out of business because the rent will go up and they'll be replaced by someplace catering to a more upscale clientele. And then guess what? Now we've got a lot more rich people moving there. Pretty soon rents are going to go up on Cap Street. Right? Because that's what happens. That's what gentrification is, and that's how it happens. Right? So you can put luxury housing in places in San Francisco and not have displacement, but I'm not sure that the Western Addition is one of them. And I think, again, if the state would allow us to stabilize existing vulnerable communities with, for example, rent control on vacant apartments and commercial rent control, it wouldn't be so much of a problem. But we're not allowed to do that. Our ability to have rent control is very much limited by the state. We can only have rent control that applies while the tenant is in the apartment. When they move out, that can go up to market rate. If we change that, and we actually did, the Board of Supervisors in 1986, I believe, passed a law putting rent controls on vacant apartments, and Dianne Feinstein vetoed it. We could have had rent control on vacant apartments. Of course, Berkeley did it, West Hollywood did it, Santa Monica did it, and then the state legislature outlawed it. So I'm not against new housing. I am against gentrification time bombs, and I don't believe that the market's going to solve our problems.
Okay, so a related question, which you sort of touched on already, but why not do as Europe does? Build decent housing with subsidies for those who can't afford it. Subsidies are normal in Germany. Many people get subsidies, not just the poor, but the middle class as well.
Oh, the European model makes a tremendous amount of sense. That's what I'm talking about. That's what social housing is. And social housing is not just housing for poor people. Social housing is non-market housing with rents adjusted depending on your income level. Right? In Vienna, Austria, most people pay 10% of their income in rent. In social housing, you pay 10%. It's pretty much fixed. If you make $1 million a year, you pay more. If you make $20,000 a year, you pay less. But you pay about 10% of your income in rent in social housing. But this is not housing that is just for one class of people. Lots of people live in social housing. Right? In Stockholm, more than half of the housing in Stockholm is social housing. All right? And this is interesting. It is allocated not on the basis of price. In the United States of America, we allocate scarce goods on the basis of price. Right? If there's not enough of it, whoever has the most money gets it. Right? In a lot of places, in Stockholm, they allocate that housing on the basis of seniority, which is interesting, right? When you first graduate from university and you get a job at Nokia, you don't get a really nice place. But after you've been in the community for 10 or 15 years, it's kind of like in college, right? Your first year, you get kind of a crappy room. But by the time you're a senior, you get a nice one. Right? That's another way of allocating housing that, is an interesting concept. I'm not saying that that's absolutely perfect, but that is an interesting concept. And that is a very different way than allocating. Now, again, so this is what I've been talking about, is we need, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 units of social housing in San Francisco, and there's nothing wrong with subsidizing it, and the money is there. Just taxing the 4,000 richest people in San Francisco, and we could have social housing. We could end homelessness and have social housing for all just by taxing 4,000 people. It seems to me that's a no-brainer, right?
Okay, so this person writes, the apartment building across from the Golden Gate Park at Haight and Stanton, isn't that an example of a rent-controlled building for low-income folks? And how did that happen?
Yeah, that was a long struggle. The Haight-Ashbury Neighborhood Council and other Haight neighbors worked on this for a long time. That McDonald's there was McDonald's, but it was also kind of an eyesore, and it attracted crime and all kinds of other things. And McDonald's didn't want that place anymore. I don't know why they ever allowed a McDonald's in the Haight anyway. How did that ever happen? Certainly before we got the formula retail laws. At any rate, McDonald's closed down, and that was a site that was designated for affordable housing. And the city bought the land, and we used city subsidies to build that affordable housing. Now, before Trump, there was some federal money. Not as much. When Ronald Reagan got elected, he basically completely cut Department of Housing and Urban Development subsidies to cities. That was one of the things that he did. The HUD used to subsidize housing in cities. Reagan decided he was going to be a suburban president, and he didn't care about cities anymore because Democrats live in cities and they weren't going to vote for him. That never came back. It didn't come back under Clinton. It didn't come back under Obama. That money, but a little tiny bit of it did. So there was some federal money. There was some state money. There's grant money. And then we've passed several affordable housing bonds where we've basically agreed to tax ourselves, or property owners have agreed to tax ourselves, although some of it gets passed through to tenants, to put up money for affordable housing. And that's where that money comes from. That's how that happened. It happened with state, federal, and local affordable housing money subsidizing the property. Now, the subsidy doesn't have to pay for the entire thing because people pay rent there. Right? People are going to pay rent. They're not going to pay $3,000 a month rent. Maybe they're paying $1,000 a month rent, or $800 a month rent, or what they can afford. But that rent comes in, and that helps pay off the cost of building the property. It's just that there's a bridge, right? Which I talked about before. It costs X dollars to build it, right? If you're building it in the private sector, investors want 6, 7, 8, 9% return on that money because that's what they can get elsewhere, right? If you're building it as a subsidized thing, you don't need that return on investment. So that saves you some money, right? You do need to pay back the banks because you have to borrow some money. So you do have to essentially have a mortgage, right? And there's a gap between what the rent at an affordable rate will bring in and what the mortgage is. And that gap is what the bond money and the affordable housing money fills. And again, the affordable housing infrastructure in San Francisco is very good. We know how to do this as a city. We have, Mission Housing, we have Mercy Housing, we have the Bernal Heights Housing Development Corporation. We have lots of nonprofit affordable housers who are good at this. And virtually all of the affordable housing that they built is clean, well-maintained, affordable, not crime-ridden. I mean, this is the subsidized affordable housing in San Francisco is a huge success story. And so I say, it's not a lack of infrastructure. It's not a lack of capability. It's not a lack of the model for how to do this. We know how to do this. It's a lack of the money. We could totally do this if we had the money.
Okay. Okay, so here's another issue. On the budget, the San Francisco budget, what will it take to avoid budget cuts to social services in 2026?
Well, that's one I've already talked about. It's a very tough one because thanks to Sacramento, it's very hard for the city to raise taxes to cover its budget deficits. So that means there's only a certain amount of money coming in, something's got to go. And a budget is a statement of priorities. And right now, the priorities of this mayor is law enforcement, and law enforcement, and law enforcement. And, and that's a high priority. We have about 500 fewer cops in San Francisco today than we did when I moved here in 1981. When I moved here in 1981, there were about 200 homicides a year. This year, I think there's been 12. I don't know. Maybe we don't need 2,000 cops in San Francisco anymore, but the mayor thinks that we do. It's going to be very difficult because we have to make those priority decisions because we're not allowed to do what we should do, which is tax the rich to pay for this stuff. In fact, they're looking at ways to cut fees on very wealthy people. And then what does it become? It becomes sales taxes, it becomes parcel taxes, and it becomes higher muni fares and higher parking tickets and higher stuff that all the rest of us pay. Right? So that is a big challenge, and that is why I say we have to look at economic inequality at every level, including the local level. And we have to make this a priority. And I don't think Daniel Lurie has ever called anyone in Sacramento, certainly not the governor, and said, hey, look, I can't make this work unless you let me have local income taxes. I don't think Gavin Newsom would sign that bill right now because Gavin Newsom is running for president. And everything he does right now is about the Gavin Newsom for president campaign. Right? An example off to the side here. When Gavin Newsom was running for governor, he supported, as did Mayor London Breed, as did every member of the Board of Supervisors, the idea of safe injection sites in San Francisco. Right? This is a way to save lives. Right? Basically, safe injection sites, they're all over the world. People do this. We're a place where people who are addicted to drugs like fentanyl or heroin can come in and safely inject those drugs in the presence of healthcare workers and also substance use counselors. Right? And if there's an overdose, and there are a lot of overdoses on the street, there's someone there who's trained to administer Narcan and reverse it, right? And there's also people on hand who basically will say to people, no judgment, we're not forcing you anything, but if you want help, it's there, right? And that's what works. You can't force people into treatment. It doesn't work. But making treatment available and saying help is there, it works. Vicka Eisen, the head of Health Right 360, talks about how she overdosed, got abscess. She was a heroin user in the Haight for many years, and she kept going into the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic and getting treated, and they never judged her. But they did say, hey, if you ever want to stop doing this, we'll help you. And she said 9 times she rejected him, and the 10th time she agreed. And she got clean, and now she's the head of Health Right 360. That's the way it works. Okay, the reason I'm saying this is, finally, and I give Scott Wiener credit for this, finally, the state legislature agreed to let San Francisco do this as a pilot program. Just San Francisco, just as a pilot program. Newsom vetoed the bill. Why? After he said he'd support it. Why did he veto a life-saving bill? Because he doesn't want to be the presidential candidate who legalized heroin and fentanyl in San Francisco. Because that's how they would play it. So anyway, that's Gavin for you.
A lot more questions, and our time is running out. But here's one as a bit of a contrarian question, or at least a challenging, I guess. Would high taxes prevent AI companies setting up in San Francisco? Or would it prevent smart people from coming here?
The data says no. All right, now, I could certainly raise the question of whether it's a good thing that AI companies are moving to San Francisco. I think that's a question for another time, but it's a question. Do we really want to be the AI capital of the world? I don't know. I think that did we really want to be the tech capital of the world in the days of Uber and Lyft and all these companies and Airbnb displacing all of these San Franciscans and driving 40,000 Latino families out of the Mission? Did we really want that? I don't know. But let's stipulate for the minute that we do want that. The data shows that taxes, particularly modest local income taxes, do not have much of an impact on where a company locates. There's data on this. This has been studied. The Harvard Business Review, all these people have studied this. And what they find is when a company is making a location decision, the number one factor is the availability of talent. Right? Are there workers who can do the job there? Right? The number 2 thing is transportation. Is it near an international airport? Can people get in and out? Can I get in and out? The number 3 thing is where the CEO wants to live. Seriously. Why did Bill Gates leave Texas and move and set up Microsoft in Redmond, Washington? Because that's where he wanted to live. That's where he's from, and that's where he wanted to live. It had nothing to do with taxes. Also, Seattle had the tech talent. He knew he could hire engineers in Seattle the way you can in San Francisco. But the taxes are like 17th on the list of why companies make location decisions. So I don't actually think that's the case. And again, the data shows that raising taxes on rich people in Manhattan is not going to cause them all to flee. It just doesn't happen. Because think about it, all right? If you make $5 million a year, and we're asking you to pay $5,000 or $10,000 in taxes, you don't even notice. You're not even going to notice. That's not the factor that makes a difference.
Okay, here's a question that's more towards activism and what people can do. First, the question is, what is your view of the streamlining task force in San Francisco, and what can activists in San Francisco do about the budget and this task force?
Okay, the streamlining task force is part of this charter reform. It's the idea of, we have a lot of commissions in San Francisco, and maybe some of them we don't need. So let's get rid of the commissions we don't need. Okay, there are commissions in San Francisco that haven't met in like 6 months because no one's been appointed to fill them and nobody really cares. But commissions are how we, the residents of San Francisco, have input into our government. Right? Commissions hold meetings. Right? The Health Commission, by the way, was put in the charter because Dianne Feinstein wouldn't allow it. So we had to override Dianne Feinstein and put the Health Commission. The Health Commission is really important, right? Because that's where people go. That's where, for example, the activists around Laguna Honda, who are working to make sure that Laguna Honda is fully certified and can handle the number of patients, and that patients are not being transferred, long-term care patients are not being transferred out of San Francisco because of Laguna Honda. That's where you go and make a fuss. And that's how things happen, right? So I'm not sure that getting rid of all these commissions is such a good idea. Right? But that's part of this entire thing. What can activists do? You can get involved at any level that you can. Right? There are going to be races for supervisor in 26. There's races for Congress. There will be possibly a race for state Senate shortly after that, depending what happens with Scott Wiener. There are all kinds of things that you can. There's going to be a ton of ballot initiatives that you can get involved in. You can go to City Hall and make your voice heard. There are groups like, there is a Neighborhoods United coalition that's working on the upzoning plan. There is the People's Budget Coalition that works on the budget and that talks about what can we do to make the budget as painless as possible and to get the best budget that we can. All of these groups are easy to find, and all of them need help, and all of them need people to work with them. The Grey Panthers are very active in San Francisco, and that's another group. There are so many groups that you can join and get involved with. And what I would encourage you to do, though, is whatever group you're involved in, don't forget economic inequality. Don't forget that that's got to be part of the discussion no matter what we do. That would be my suggestion, advice for you.
Okay, one question related to immigration. How do you think San Francisco government leaders are doing in defending the community, our community, from ICE? For example, funds for immigrant families deported or detained. How about regarding funding lawyers to defend immigrants and supporting businesses impacted because they're losing business because people are afraid to go out, for example, to restaurants, things like that?
That's a very good question. And in fact, it is something that some folks in San Francisco are doing quite well on. The Board of Supervisors just agreed to allocate, I'm going to get this number wrong, $6 million? Something like that for immigrant legal defense and for immigrant support in San Francisco. That's going to pass on Tuesday. It's got like 9 co-sponsors. I think Jackie Fielder was the main sponsor, but I think there's 9 co-sponsors. Everyone's in favor. I can't see Lurie vetoing that. Right, that's money we're taking out of the reserves. I think we are the only public defender's office in California that has an immigration defense unit. So we do have, there is free legal support for immigrants who are facing deportation in San Francisco. I have not heard Daniel Lurie stand up on the steps of City Hall and say, ICE is not welcome here. He's been a little more subtle, and he's tried to work with Donald Trump to keep the federal groups out of San Francisco by being nice to him, and maybe that works. I don't know. But I think certainly on the Board of Supervisors, we've got a lot of people standing up and doing this. It is tough, though, particularly with the current way ICE is operating. We used to have, we are a sanctuary city in the sense that the San Francisco police can't cooperate with ICE. We used to have actual sanctuary. ICE used to not be allowed to go into churches. That was a policy. ICE was not allowed to go into places of worship and haul people out. Trump changed that. ICE is now allowed to come in here and look around for immigrants and haul them out. That didn't used to be the case. So there are things like that that we used to be able to do as a city that we can't do now. We cannot stop ICE from going to immigration court. This is really cruel, right? You're applying for asylum, you're applying for legal status as an immigrant in the United States. You have to make an appointment in immigration court every few months and make sure that you haven't committed any crimes and continue the paperwork. You're required to do that. If you miss an appointment, your opportunity to get a green card or to become a citizen is limited, right? You're not supposed to miss your appointment. So now what they do is they send ICE to the immigration court, and when people come in legally in this country to meet with their counselor and make an appointment, they get arrested and deported. That's incredibly cruel. We can't stop, the city and county of San Francisco can't stop them from doing that. Anyway, it's really, really rough. But we are making, there are resources available for people in San Francisco, and there are many, I don't know how many of you have seen the cards that are being handed out. I think they're red mostly, these cards are handed out. We should have a stack of them here. I should have. We have them here? At the table, good, okay. And these are cards that you can hand out to people, and they say, these are your rights as an immigrant. And it has a script on it that says to an ICE officer, I do not want to talk to you. I'm not providing you with any documents. You cannot come into my house unless you have a warrant signed by a judge or a magistrate. Right? These are things that we are doing in San Francisco, and we should be doing. I teach at USF, and USF has posters all over basically saying, I, as a teacher, am not allowed to allow an ICE person into a room. I am supposed to call public safety and the Office of the General Counsel and have them handle it, right? And so there are things that people can do, and there's things that institutions can do, and I think we're doing a lot of it in San Francisco. I think I'm out of time.
Yeah, it looks that way. So we have an announcement, and then we're going to end the program. But first, I'd just like to have applause for our incredible speaker. Okay, and now Art has an announcement to make.
Thank you for this great forum, and Tim Redmond. The announcement I want to make is that every year on December 10th, globally, it's Human Rights Day. And there will be, we'll be celebrating that or marking that day in San Francisco on the East Steps of City Hall on December 10th at noon. So you're all invited, and we have flyers on the table back there, so please pick one up. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for listening. Thank you for everybody coming here.
And regarding forum next week and the weeks following that, just look in the flame. There'll be announcements for it. Okay.
I'm just going to make a quick pitch here too before you all leave. 48 Hills lives on donations. We are completely reader supported. If you like what we're doing at 48 Hills and you can afford it, if you can donate $5, $10, $20 a month or whatever, that lets us budget. If you can do more, that's great. If you can't do it, it's fine. It will be free anyway, no matter what. But we survive entirely on reader donations. So that's my quick pitch. Thank you.